Okay. Microphone. There we go. Do. Okay, there we go. Okay. Ah, fun times. Okay. So, ah, today, we are going to keep talking about families. I fully anticipate being able to finish that particular unit, and then move on to religion. Like definitely, probably today, but definitely, next week. And we're rounding through kind of our final topics as we, move really, really quickly towards the end of the course. Okay, so had a couple of questions last time that I didn't get to answer because we ran out of time. So I will answer them now. So this question, when it comes to nonlinear ways to marriage or to relationships, are these marriages more satisfying than the linear path? Are there negative consequences? This is really complicated to talk about. I think, what we're seeing with the less linear path, through from where you start relationships to where you end up with kind of long-term partnerships. It's less clear to people. It's less clear how you move through them. It's given a certain select group of men, right? The really high status men, a lot more power in the sort of mating market. They're much more able to kind of dictate the terms of when relationships start, when relationships progress, and when relationships end. Um, so we've seen less marriages, we've seen more marital breakdown in general, later ages at first marriage, all of this stuff. So it's a complex question, right? Whether it's better than the linear path. The linear path certainly had example, or good aspects where it was very clear how people progressed through relationships and they tended to be very durable. Today, it's much less clear and they are less durable. When is the final? Oh, I don't remember off the top of my head. It's at 8:30 in the morning though, which is like horrifyingly cruel. I didn't pick the time. I am as offended as you are. Um, sorry, did you have your hand up? The 23rd at 8:30 in the morning in this room. I'm sorry. As I said, they decided this crazy thing where they want us to have 3 exams per day be possible. And so the earliest time slot used to be 9, which I thought was painful enough. Now it's 8:30, which I think is ungodly, but to write an exam at 8:30 in the morning, it is great pain and suffering for all of us. Um, mostly for you. I just have to walk around and drink my coffee and answer any questions. It's much worse for you, but I am sorry. I didn't get to choose the time. They tell us you teach at this time on Tuesday, your exam is that day at that time. So if I had to choose, it would have been at like 3:30 on some day because I feel like that's a much more human time. Okay. What are specific examples of how money problems lead to divorce? I think that's pretty straightforward, right? It's people get stressed out about money. One partner is spending too much money. One partner is not bringing in enough money, but still spending and maybe wanting a certain lifestyle. You're having trouble affording your bills. You're falling into debt. The bill collectors are coming and you start fighting about it and it kind of wears down your relationship, right? That's pretty much how it goes. Okay, great questions. Okay, so, maybe that's a little loud. Maybe I should turn that down a little. Okay, so when we talk about divorce, right, we were talking last time, right, we ended off on this slide talking about how a lot of our early studies of the consequences of divorce showed pretty strong deficits, right, for the children of divorce in terms of like academic achievement, career achievement, life satisfaction, and all sorts of outcomes. They were flawed, and since then, other studies have sort of come along and had different sorts of results. Now, that said, I tend to think, again, there's a really strong polarization in the kind of research on the effects of divorce on children. Between it doesn't, and the results sort of are, well, it depends on the kind of divorce and how parents deal with it, to it's sort of universally bad for kids. So I'll make a few comments here in terms of what the bulk of the research says, and then maybe a few after that. So most of the time, the kind of theoretical core in like sociology of the family that people use to study divorce is a theory called stress theory. And without going too much into stress theory, basically stress theory will say that experiences like divorce, they can cause stress, like they cause stress, right? And it's how that stress is dealt with that ultimately decides whether that experience is going to be kind of positive, neutral, negative. So it doesn't necessarily threaten well-being if it's dealt with properly. All right. So divorce is less stressful and therefore, potentially less challenging for children. So when parents, are there and continue, can you see that okay? It's a little dim on my screen. When they basically are there and supporting their kids through the process, right? And that would be both parents, right? When both parents are there and supporting their kids through the process. The less change you can put in your children's daily lives and routines, the less problem it's going to be for the kids, right? So things that will tend to really exacerbate kind of the problems that come with divorce are things like moving, right? Changing schools, changing communities, new communities, right? Forcing people to make new friends, right? These are really stressful experiences for young people. And when they're already dealing with the stress of knowing that their parents' relationship has broken down and is ending, and they're not going to be co-resident with both parents anymore, when you add these things on, that it's going to lead to a lot of stress because they're just having to navigate through a lot of different aspects of life, right? So if you can keep, their routines and kind of their life relatively stable, right, then it's going to mitigate some of those problems. And of course, when kids are encouraged to talk about their feelings, right, when parents, help them through it, maybe get them therapy, right, all of these things tend to help. Okay, now on the other hand, it tends to be bad when parents are too overwhelmed to be effective caregivers, right? So this is most common when you end up with a sort of, going from a dual parent family to a single parent family. And, especially when one parent, withdraws a lot, right? So they really pull out of their kids' lives, and they leave the other parent with the financial, the emotional, and the time burden of dealing with the kids essentially by themselves. So if suddenly, let's say mom or dad has to get a second job to pay for everything because, suddenly they're on, just one person's income, and now they're too stressed out to really give that emotional care to kids, that's going to be a problem, right? So if they're not effective caregivers, let's say they're too busy with all the work, and they're leaving their kids unsupervised a lot of the time, that's generally bad. And yeah, when divorce moves them out of neighborhoods, away from peers, positive adult role models, away from their schools, right? All of these things tend to be bad. And when children become the pawns in their parents' divorce or and the subsequent relationship, right? I remember this one kid my daughter went to school with, um, and his parents. I remember being, I guess it was the dad who was brutal with this, right? That he was the fun one, and he was the one. I think that they were in the first grade, and he was letting his son watch Deadpool on the weekends, even though Deadpool, nothing wrong with it aside from the violence and the sexual innuendo and the swearing, right? Certainly not appropriate for a first grader. But he was doing that to be the cool one, right? And so that his kids would like him more than they liked their mom, right? And he would buy them iPads and all of this stuff, and basically try to get them to sort of side with him, in his ongoing divorce proceedings and the emotional tug of war with mom. And this is not generally good for kids for obvious reasons, right? They feel like they have to take a side. They might feel like they could lose some of their parents' affection if it happens that they don't take the right one. Okay. Uh, Sorry, I shouldn't laugh at that comment. Of course, I think every kid wishes their parents didn't divorce, right? Like, I don't think any kid was ever like, man, I really wish my parents would get a divorce. I don't think that's a very common sentiment for kids. I'm sorry your parents got divorced. That sucks. When we say education leads to less divorce rate, doesn't necessarily mean institutional education because those in today's world is getting influenced negatively. I don't understand what this question means or this statement. Is this a statement or I don't know. There's no question mark. When we say education leads to less divorce rate, it doesn't necessarily mean institutional education because those in today's world is getting. Okay, your grammatically incorrect sentence is confusing me. I don't mean to shame you, but I don't understand what you're saying. Now, I will say this: education. We are talking about institutional education. Why? And why does institutional education, right, like university, tend to lead to less divorce? Higher incomes, right? Higher incomes tend to lead to less divorce for a whole bunch of reasons. You can kind of work through a lot of the problems when you have more money, and more educated people tend to make more money. Also, they get married a little bit later, right? The more educated you are, you tend to have later marriage, which means you're a little bit more mature. So it's not entirely the education, but education does play a big part, especially in the money part. Can divorce sometimes be better for children instead of their parents staying in toxic bad relationship? Yes, I think I have that somewhere. I don't know. I should have it somewhere. Okay. Um, yes, I think I had it somewhere. I maybe took it out or it's on another slide, but I can answer that question right away. Yeah, if parents are constantly fighting, right, and that is causing stress in the child's life, right? They're in a house and their parents are fighting all the time, and it's just like this elevated level of stress. That can lead to better outcomes, right? Because suddenly they might be in a less stressful situation, and that is generally good for kids. So yes. All right. So economic hardship. Now, economic hardship is really, really common after divorces or the end of long-term relationships. And what typically happens, women's income and or like the capital they have available to them tends to decline. Men's tends not to. And I mean, the reason is like when we talk about like single parent households, about 80% of them are women, about 20% are men, right? So there's 80%, like if you look at your single income households or single parent households, rather, 80% of them are single moms, 20% of them are single dads, right? So if you look at the kind of general statistics, this 80% will often, A, have to move, maybe get a different job, or reduce the number of hours they work to kind of balance with childcare. So their wages tend to go down. Men, on the other hand, because they're only 20% of the kind of lone parent families, generally speaking, that other 80%, right, or that other percentage of men who aren't the lone parents, they will continue to work their normal hours, continue to earn their normal salaries, and all of that stuff, right? I have one good friend of mine. He's kind of going through this now, and for like the first 3 years, he was split from his ex. The kids lived with her, and he got to actually his income actually increased because all of a sudden, right, he could work all of the extra overtime shifts at work, right? So anytime he's a plumber. Anytime there was an extra call, he's like, yeah, I'll take that one. I got nothing else to do because, bless you, he wasn't living with his kids. Now, in the last few months, he got custody of his kids. Mom, anyway, I won't tell you the story, but it's a pretty horrible one. She just left. She's like, the kids are at home at my house. Go get them. I'm done. And, that was bad. It did not go well. Anyway, now he's like, oh, I'm having trouble making more money because I have to be home at 4:30 to get dinner on for my kids. And I'm like, yeah, that's what happens. Live with it. Okay. Um, but that's the typical scenario, right? Men will either see their income change little or actually it can go up because they're actually freed up to work more if it's possible. Okay. The other thing, men on the whole tend to earn more than women in general. For a bunch of reasons, the kinds of careers that people choose There's a male-female disparity where men tend to move into industries that make a little bit more money. But that's, a story for another time. And children typically live with divorced moms, right? 80-20 after the split. You have that. Okay, and child support. Child support is this legal thing that's supposed to kind of help balance those scales. And it's only something like, okay, so in couples that get divorced, it's only about 50% of them that have either a formal or informal child care or child support agreement. So about half of them do not, right? So about half of lone parent families are probably not getting any kind of child support at all. And even when people are receiving child support, so it's very rare. I think in the US, the statistic was like something like only 66% of all of the child support that is supposed to be paid annually actually gets paid, right? So, that's leaving 33% or 34% on the table. So that's not a ton, right? And the amounts tend to be quite inadequate, right? I remember, some friends getting their like actual court ordered child support, and it was like not. I think one of them said it wasn't even enough to pay for like her daughter's gymnastics class for the year, right? Like it's a very, very small amount. It tends to be, and there's a lot of games people can play to avoid paying child support, and all of this kind of stuff. So, well, it's a good idea. It's often, hard to manage. The government, which is supposed to kind of manage the child support system, often doesn't manage it very well. People get in arrears, right? So they haven't paid it. It takes the government a long time to find them, maybe garnish their wages, and actually get them. And in the meantime, right, you might be leaving your former partner and your children without that kind of child support. So it's all, well, I was going to say it's all good. No, it's terrible. Okay, let's switch pen colors to get go a little darker. So big source of stress also, right? So if we talk about stress, is reduced contact with the non-resident parent, right? Okay. So again, there's a fair bit of disparity when we talk about the effects of this overall and kind of what it means, and whether it's bad or whether it's not, right? So I think the bulk of the research kind of ends up kind of on this point. And I know like this is written by Lisa Strachan, who's one of our professors in the department. She knows the family stuff really, really well. And like stress theory basically says, right, it's not the amount of contact with the non-resident parent that makes a difference, but the degree of cooperation and commitment to shared parenting that determines whether that contact helps or hinders, right? Okay, so are the parents working together, right? Are they doing well? Do they have an agreement where they're co-parenting, they're getting along well, they have a plan for how this is going to work and what it means and who shows up at activities, how each parent supports the children through the divorce. That tends to be a big support. Now, I will say one thing, which I know Lisa is a little bit dicey on because I know her and I know what she wrote in this chapter, and she doesn't love this, but I think the data is fairly overwhelming. Reduced contact with non-resident parents tends to be harder on boys, right? Because mostly they're living with their mothers and their dads are suddenly gone. And it's that loss of connection with that same hard for mothers to manage teenage boys, and they lose that kind of role model in the house, which is really difficult on boys and teen boys especially. And again, that's not to say that like single moms don't do a tremendous job and that it's very difficult and that they're doing their best. There are just these kind of broad statistical effects that we can talk about. Okay, about half of divorced parents subsequently remarry or cohabit, and the number's actually been going down. It used to be a lot closer to like 75%. That number's actually been dropping over time, and it's continuing to drop. I mean, this is for Canada. If we see the States, it's now down to closer to a third, maybe like 2/5. So it's actually declining. So people who get divorced may often think, that they'll find another relationship, but many actually really struggle to do so after they get out of their relationships. So, take that for what it's worth. Okay, in this one, when we talk about step families, so yeah, a lot of people do remarry, right? They get step families or sort of cohabiting partners that come into the house. A lot of them, you know, derive very little benefit from the additional income and supervision that step parents bring to the household. So there's a couple of things that are going on here, and this is a fairly broad statement, but it's really well supported by the data. And again, this is not to say that there aren't great step parents. There absolutely are. Just when we talk, overall statistics, we're taking everybody into account, not particular circumstances. Okay, so what happens? So one of the things that happens when someone, gets divorced, they still have kids, and they get married to someone else or cohabit with someone else, you get a focus on the new relationship. So that parent, even the one, that consistent parent that you're living with still, will start to focus on that new relationship, right? That new romantic relationship that they've entered into. And that becomes the focus of both people rather than the kids. A stepmom, stepdaughter kind of issue that often happens. Okay. And then, when we talk about stepdads, if you bring a stepdad into the house, and again, I'm not saying that every stepdad is this, or that there aren't great stepdads. There absolutely are, but you increase the chances of children in the home being sexually or physically abused by 100 times, right? So it's a massive increase in essentially the chances that a child will be like physically or sexually abused by bringing a step parent into the home. And now there's broad socioeconomic patterns here as well. It does track downward. It goes up as you go downward in class, but it's not absent from, say, like the middle and upper classes either, right? So, and I mean, on the whole, step parents tend to just be more hesitant to invest their resources into children that aren't biologically their own, right? And this, I'm not big into like social psychology or the like biosocial psych that some people are, even in our own department. But there does almost seem to be like an evolutionary imperative to put resources into offspring that are genetically related to you rather than other offspring. And it seems like that happens in a lot of step parent relationships. And again, just to be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of anything or saying that there aren't great step parents. There absolutely are, but statistically speaking, it's problematic. Now, if you get into kind of like cohabitation, it's a completely different story. Let's say someone moves from kind of monogamy or even like single parenthood into bringing a series of like shifting partners into the home, then the whole thing goes kind of crazy, right? You can be talking, it depends on where you are positionally in society. But let's say, mom is bringing in a series of male partners, the chances of physical or sexual abuse for children goes up even past 100 times, right? And the more partners you introduce, the greater the chances of kind of abuse are, right? But again, we're talking here like typically short-term relationship, short-term cohabiting, rather than like true step-parent families. Okay. Oh, I answered you. All right. I forgive you. Forgive me for not understanding what you were trying to say. Okay, I'm going to answer this question. Why are some people mainly men? Why do some people, mainly men, get upset about child support? Like, why is it for some reason a hotly debated fee? Your child needs money, so you pay it. All right. So here's the kind of theory, and I take this again from an economist. Her name is Melissa Kearney. This is from Mark. This might be from Mark Regnerus. I can't remember actually which one it was that I was reading because I read them at the same time. I think this is actually from Mark Regnerus, and he wrote a book about marriage. One of the things that happens here when you talk about things like child support or spousal support or alimony that seems to rankle people, right or wrong, is that, how to put this? you've sort of given up the benefits of marriage, right? So the benefits of marriage in terms of like having, a life partner, having emotional support, having access to someone else's body for sexual needs and gratification and all of that stuff that you tend to get out of marriage, but you end up still being tied to that person and still paying. You know, it's you're paying the kind of financial way that you would if you were married, right? You're transferring resources to the other person, but getting no benefits back. And this again, I actually agree with the premise of your question. Yeah, if you have children, you should pay for them. That's how it goes. I have no problem with that statement. I think what rankles people is that in a lot of ways, right, you've gotten divorced, but you're still tied to that person in terms of financial support and without any of the benefits that you get from marriage. So that exchange relationship that marriage um, is broken on one end, right? You continue to supply financial support, but get none of the kind of benefits back the other way. And that I think is, if we want to talk at a deep level, that's what sort of rankles people is you're kind of tied to that person, even though you're not getting those benefits of being with that person anymore. But again, I broadly agree with the premise of your question. Um, so yeah, so more people are getting educated today than at any time. And in some ways, the divorce rate has actually dropped considerably, but so has the marriage rate. So it's hard to know. Fewer people are getting married, and so fewer people are getting divorced. Especially if you looked at like divorces per 100,000 people, that number has gone down pretty precipitously. The percentage of marriages that end in divorce hasn't. Well, it went down from about 50 to about 40%, so it has dropped. Um, but fewer people are getting married also. And not all of that is cohabitation. A lot of people are just my sister who lives alone with her cats. Um, I hope that someone finds her body and the cats don't eat it. That's my great fear for my sister, that she'll just disappear. And people will be like, what happened to her? And then we'll find out she was eaten by her cats. Okay, if there's no prenup, let's say the man is the only one working, how much is the wife entitled to legally if there's no prenup? Okay, so I'm going to phrase this as delicately as I can. I am not a divorce lawyer. So yeah, I'm just a dumb sociologist. I didn't do 4 years of law school. But my basic understanding of this is 50% of the assets that were earned during the period where they were married are hers, right? So like if you bought a house together after you got married, 50% of it is hers. Let's say you bought a house 5 years before you met her, you get whatever appreciation happened in that 5 years all to yourself, and any other value that increased of that house after that, you split it 50-50. And again, it depends on the jurisdiction, as far as I know. Things like alimony, basically you were kind of on the hook to support her lifestyle, like so that she doesn't see a marked decrease in her lifestyle as a result of the divorce, especially if you were the one who initiated the divorce and the legal way that this is dealt with is changing a little bit. So, cool. Great legal question for me, who is not a lawyer. And so I could have gotten that wrong, by the way, but that's my kind of general understanding of the law. Mostly comes from all my friends who are getting divorced at the moment, or have in the last 5 years. So there you go. Okay. Oh, reproductive choice. Hot about an issue that you are. Just checking how many slides I have left here. Not very many. Oh, and no question slides. I'll have to go back to that one. Okay, so reproductive choice, right? When we talk about reproductive choice, this is obviously something that's become possible really since the 1960s. Contraception is first kind of introduced in the U.S. market in the late 1950s, and in Canada in the kind of early to mid 1960s. And so, pretty obviously, women have more choice and say over, whether and when and how many children they are going to have than any time in the past. And this is mostly exercised through contraception, right? And then abortion for those times that contraception fails or wasn't used or whatever. Okay. So, in terms of attitudes on reproductive choice, like Canada seems pretty universally, broadly across education, socioeconomic categories in favor of things like abortion. There are kind of variations in kind of attitudes about abortion, and I guess it's far less consensusy than it's sometimes made out to be. Though, generally speaking, only a very small portion of the Canadian population would want to see abortion banned altogether. If you ask the questions, in different ways, you get slightly different results. Like, how long should abortion be available for? Um, you know, Technically speaking, Canada has no limits on how long you can get an abortion during a pregnancy, right? We actually have no law governing it whatsoever. So you can do it at any point. If you ask, a broad swath of Canadians, you'll get, answers that vary, usually, somewhere between 15 weeks. You should be able to get an abortion for 15 weeks all the way to 9 months, right? And this is kind of broadly spread. There's no real socioeconomic or educational patterns in why people choose these kinds of answers. Generally speaking, almost no one wants to see abortion criminalized, across the political and even religious spectrum. No one wants to see it, made a crime to procure an abortion. But attitudes beyond that vary widely. So, it's pretty settled in some senses. But when you actually dig down into the issues, there's a lot of complexity in people's attitudes towards abortion, and it's a sort of third rail in Canadian politics that no one will ever touch for obvious reasons. Okay, yeah, for some women, reproductive choice increasingly means facilitating pregnancies. Now, this has become especially an issue um, as the age of first marriage, right? So first marriage has gone up, and most people want to wait until they're married to have kids, or at least in a long-term partnership. And the age of mothers, when their first children are born, has also gone up considerably. So one of the things that's happening, right, is we see, virtually in Canada, no teen pregnancies, like not actually zero, but statistically speaking, it's an incredibly tiny number, the lowest we've ever seen in history, right? If teen pregnancy was ever a major social issue, it's really not anymore. But we're seeing fewer kind of pregnancies between 20 and 29. And increasingly, right, we're seeing the bulk of, and I actually just did this because I did a big demographic calculation for another class and trying to figure out, like, if we wanted to raise total fertility in Canada, like how many children would, or what percentage of women in Canada would have to have like 3 children or more, because you can't have 2.1 children. It doesn't work for obvious reasons. And it was like 55% of Gen Z women would have to have 3 or more children. And I was like, oh, well, we're not reaching total, replacement fertility. That is simply not going to happen. But the bulk, I looked at the statistics, right? And it looks like the bulk of our childbearing kind of women are between basically 30 and about 44. Now, once you get past 35, you're considered a geriatric pregnancy, right? It sounds really bad because geriatric means old. My wife took umbrage because we had our third kid when she was 36. She got pregnant when she was 36. And they're like, okay, so because this is a geriatric pregnancy, she did not like that word. But after kind of 35, fertility declines sharply, and it's much harder to get pregnant. So as you have more women kind of in this age, and already, like by the time you hit here, it's declining. It hits a really sharp decline at 35. So as we were having more people trying to have children in this kind of later frame of fertility, we're seeing more focus on even like reproductive rights or reproductive choice being helping people who are having trouble having kids have children, right? So we see things like artificial insemination a little bit, but mostly things like in vitro and increasingly things like surrogate motherhood, right? So in vitro is where basically you take eggs and from mom and sperms from dad, and you combine them in a petri dish and create embryos and then try to implant them. It's excessively expensive. It's so I've had some I would say friends, but acquaintances do this, and like for it was something like $35,000 for every attempt, right? Like it was. I was like, man, that is a sizable down payment on a house. Um, but they really wanted to have kids, so they were gunning for in vitro, and that's what they paid, right? It was like 35 grand a shot. I think at one point they went over to Greece because in Greece it was only about 15,000, so it was a little bit cheaper. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Things like this, in vitro fertilization, surrogate motherhood, where you actually, if there's a problem with, if someone's had a lot of miscarriages, or there's a problem with getting pregnant, maybe you pick a surrogate mother to actually carry the child to term. And we've seen this get more popular with gay couples, particularly. Basically choosing an egg from an egg bank and basically fertilizing it with the sperm from one of the two male partners, and then having a surrogate carry it to term. And yeah, various screening techniques, especially for diseases or medical conditions, especially things like Down syndrome, allowing people very early to see what conditions their baby would have, and then decide whether they want to continue with that pregnancy or terminate. Um, and that itself has been very controversial in some quarters, because disability rights advocates have said, you know people with Down syndrome, yeah, there's lots of places in Europe, particularly Iceland, that have said they've eliminated Down syndrome, and disability rights advocates have said, well, you didn't eliminate the medical condition, you just aborted every child who would have been born with it, and that's a different thing. So you have a sort of weird right to life thing with a lot of disability rights activists saying, children with Down syndrome should be allowed life as well. But these screening techniques has meant that most parents choose not to bring, say, Down syndrome children to term. Okay. Oh, no questions on any of that. Super. Okay. How am I doing for time? Oh, I'm doing okay. So, lots of social, ethical, legal issues around all of these things as well, right? And obviously, we've had lots of changes in terms of family forms, family structures. When you bring same-sex couples into the equation, you have all sorts of questions that pop up, right? And reproductive technologies and kind of social changes bring up a lot of sociological kind of questions. You know, Questions about discrimination or things like, mother and father. Some people have argued that mother and father are these antiquated terms that seem to be obsolete or vague given the sort of new family forms that are coming. Because, if someone has, same-sex parents, right, who's mother and father in that equation? Um, you know, anyway, if parents are transgender, um, whose mother and father do they ascribe to those names? How do they want to be identified? So there's been some kind of talk and discussion as to how these terms should work going forward, whether they should be abandoned. A lot of people, obviously, for lots of reasons, don't want these terms. They're rather attached to them, so they don't want them abandoned at all. But it remains a kind of contested space. Okay, we also have a growth of, so obviously we have the growth of single, kind of people who are single. It's something like 1 in 5, or about 20% of people in Canada, right? So will never get married. It's about 20%. And we also have the rise increasingly of zero-child families, where basically two people get married or cohabit, but choose not to have children, right? So yeah, about 1/5 of North American women, 40 to 45, have never given birth, right? So they have no children at all. And sometimes this is due to infertility, but increasingly, right, we see people choosing not to have kids. There's questions about the cost of raising children, right, and how difficult it is, but also being, basically child-free, I guess is the term that people have started to use, has become an increasingly attractive alternative for lots of people, where you can get sort of the benefits of say, marriage, in terms of dual incomes without any of the responsibilities and being tied down that comes with kids. So sometimes these folks are referred to as, uh, dinks, dual income, no kids, boop, 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 right? Um, I always like this picture. It's the child-free family that's just the man, woman, and a pile of money. This again, you can find this on YouTube as a lifestyle that people promote, because it's like, okay, we have no kids. We travel to Europe. We go on a European vacation every year, right? We sleep in every Sunday, and certainly, a lot of celebrities, I think here of particularly Seth Rogen, have promoted this kind of lifestyle as well. Now, zero-child families do tend to be more satisfied with their marriage than those with a child. However, happiness declines as they get older, right? And especially once they hit kind of their late 40s to early 50s, people with kids, they get much happier and more satisfied with life, and our kind of dual income, no kids, become less and less satisfied with their lives over time. Okay. Is this my last slide? Yeah. Yes. Oh, no. I did not mean to do that. Okay. Discard. Okay, I'm going to go back to my last slide, then I'll go see if there's any questions. And then, if we have extra time, and I think we will, we'll move on to religion. Which will take me a second to load. Okay, so lone parent families. Okay, so our lone parent families, all right, we talked about them a little bit. Generally speaking, this is a kind of family form that's become more common since the 1960s, became much more common starting in the 1980s, and now has become, fairly normative. It's not something that people look at as problematic all that much anymore. Used to be, right, that it generally happened mostly due to the death of a parent. Now it's usually because of kind of relational breakdown or people having children who were never in a permanent relationship. Yeah, we have the rise of like single, never married mothers as one of the big groups. And again, this tracks socioeconomically in interesting ways, right? You see, like if you look at the US, right, you see almost none of it in kind of Asian communities. Asian communities have very few single mothers. White families have fewer than other demographics, and then Latinos and Black people have many more single mother families, and they tend to be much poorer on the whole. And I could do like a whole spiel on this. Melissa Kearney's book called The Two-Parent Privilege, which I've mentioned a few times, is a really interesting, like, deep economics look at it. But we've probably said enough about this at this point and are good to move on, I think. I'm going to check the questions, and then I'll load my religion slides, and we'll keep going from there. All right, no questions here. Okay, this will just take me half a sec, and I will load up religion, and you can load it up too, and we'll go from there. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, as of today, we have 5 lectures left. So after today's lecture, we essentially have 5 lectures left. So we are, we're very much getting towards the end of the course. So I'm just going to switch the Slido back to the same one we were just using, if I can find it. Sure. Okay, we'll try that. I think I got the right one. Okay. So yeah, I think we have 5 lectures left. So 2 next week, 2 the week after, and then a final closing lecture in the last week of class, which will just be like, Q&A and maybe cleaning up a few straggling concepts. So we are almost, we're very, very close to the end. All right. So religion. Oh, so this is for me. I don't know about you. For me, this is one of my favorite subjects, and I teach a whole other class on it, which is SOC 376, Sociology of Religion. And it's one of my kind of pet areas, right? 10 years of my life sort of spent reading and thinking and writing about it. So I'm going to try to not let too much of that creep into your basic introduction to sociology of religion. But if you want to come take a course with me, it's in the winter term. Um, I think, and I actually think it might be in the same time slot as this one, Tuesday, Thursday, winter term, but in a totally different spot on campus. I love that class. It's a hoot, and I love talking about religion because it's super fun. When is the best time for women to have kids? When they're ready. Um, uh, from a sociological perspective. Okay, so generally speaking, if you want to like, when is it good to have kids? Like biologically, if we're talking biologically, you're kind of most physically able to have kids like between like 15 and about like 28, after which point fertility really starts to decline and you get increasing kind of health issues that come with pregnancy, right? You're more likely to get things like preeclampsia. um, Sociologically, definitely get married before you have kids. That is 100%. There's really no, if you want your kids to do well, you should definitely be married. You should probably have completed your education, which I don't think any of you are in risk of not doing. But you should probably also start before your mid 30s because it just gets a lot harder. Um, and trust me, I had a kid kind of in my late 30s. Keeping up with a 5-year-old at 42 is way harder than it was when I was younger and kept up with my two older kids. So, you know, but biologically, the earlier the better, but that's not necessarily the case sociologically. What are the prereqs for 376? You're sitting in it. SOS 100 or consent of the instructor, and you'll have SOS 100, so you're good. How does SOS 376 compare to this SOS 100 class difficulty content? Um, I mean, it's a third year course, so it's harder. The content is much more specific. It's a lot more theoretical, right? Especially at the beginning, like the first third of the course is just like theories of religion. Um, so it's a third year class. It's much more difficult. There's no multiple choice. It's all short answer. And if they would ever give me a class with less than 100 people, I'd do essays. But they don't do that because what's what's my second favorite religion? My second favorite, it's got to be Scientology, because it's so weird and it's super fun to talk about. So my second favorite religion is definitely Scientology. Um, yeah, my second. It's just so much fun. Like when you actually get into um, talking about Scientology, it's a lot of fun. Okay, like I'm definitely a scholar of Christianity at my core. So like I think Christianity, the rise of Christianity, how it came to basically conquer the Roman Empire, is one of the most fascinating historical stories from a sociological perspective. So that's my favorite. It's the most fun to talk about. So Scientology, not recently. I mean, there was a time where we had a professor here, not me, who did a class on cults, and he did a lot of stuff on Scientology. And the Scientologists kept trying to track him down to serve him with lawsuits, so he couldn't have his name on his office door. And if someone came and asked you, "Where's Steve? Do you know where Steve Kent's office is?" You were like, "I've never heard of that person. I don't know who that is." And that they told you that when you started working here and when you started as a student. It's like, I know you know where Steve's class or offices. You can't tell anyone if they come looking because it's probably a process server who's trying to serve him with papers. So I kind of try to avoid Scientologists if I can, in general. There's another cult that keeps stopping me almost like it's right by the Earls. For whatever reason, they have people that hang out there and they'll stop me. And I think they're about to ask for directions. And they're like, "Have you ever heard of God as Mother?" And I'm like, "You guys got me again. Like, I'm really busy. I'm like, I don't have time for your weird culty bullshit." Um, so they're like, "But you know that Jesus was reborn as a woman in Korea." Like, yeah, I know that's what you think, but I have to go pick up my kids. I'm sorry. Do you know that even mentioning us means you're going to get sued, right? Lawyer up. Okay. I do have friends who are lawyers, so I feel pretty safe. Okay. Have I looked into the Order of the Golden Dawn? That sounds like something from a Harry Potter novel. So no, I haven't looked at the Order of the Golden Dawn. All right, let's talk about religion. Okay, is that my first slide? Okay, so what are religions, right? Oh, what is religion? Sometimes it hurts me to do this in SOS 100 because I literally spend like a week and a half or maybe 2 weeks on this in SOS of religion in kind of general ways, right? Religions are, human ways of interacting, or human ways of interacting with what they believe to be something that's transcendent or divine, or otherworldly in some way. Whether or not we believe that they exist, right? And from a sociological perspective, I think most sociologists are atheists for the most part. But, from a sociological perspective, we don't really care whether religions are true or not, and we have no way of proving the truth or falsity of religious claims from a sociological perspective. All we can see is the social effects of religion, right? And religions are, what it means to have faith and the way it shapes human lives and communities. Okay. So, when we talk about religion, right, and what it means to study religion from a sociological perspective, in a lot of ways, we talk about these things in sociology, right? So, things that we can observe and measure, right? So, attitudes. Hello, laggy pen. What people think, what they believe, what they think, what their views are, how it affects their politics, how it affects, you know, purchasing behavior, where they live, all of those kinds of things. Okay, behaviors, how they act, right? What they actually do in their day-to-day lives and how religion informs that, and communities, how they organize. And generally speaking, like when we this is a weird way of putting it. I think I may have this on another slide. I can't remember now. I wasn't sure we'd get here today, so I didn't review them. Um, but we tend to talk about kind of three major things when we talk about religion: belief, behavior, and belonging. Okay, oops, those are the three B's of the sociology of religion. So when we're looking to say, do a survey or do some research on religious people or on religion, we're generally interested in asking questions about the three B's, about belief, behavior, and belonging. Okay, so our kind of study of religion from a sociological perspective should also generally include things that can't be measured, right? So how people sense, the transcendent in their lives, how their belief in God or gods or whatever it is that they happen to believe, the force, Brahma, whatever it happens to be, how that sort of how they sense that in their lives, how they feel it, how they connect to it. And very importantly, how that is passed on from one generation to the next, right? How do religions kind of find continuity from one generation to another? Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back and see if there's any questions. Oh, did I upload the wrong slides? All right. Well, just go with it. Hang on. Do you have this slide? Do you have substantive? I may have redesigned them and forgot to upload the new ones. Ah. That's weird. So it starts here? Hmm. Okay, I think I know what happened. I'm going to fix it right now. It's great TV. I know what happened is I changed this like a year and a half ago. And I think eClass, or when Canvas auto imported from eClass, it must have been an older version, or I selected an older version of the course. So I'm going to fix it. I'm going to delete the ones you have, and I'm going to, did my mic just die? I just turned it off. There, oh, the battery's dying. Everything's going right at the end of the course. All right, I'll have to change the battery. I'm going to delete the religion slides, and I'm going to upload new ones. And then, I will fix the order of them later so that you have what I'm talking about. Sorry about that. This is an auto import problem from eClass to Canvas. eClass is going to be killed. Canvas is the new power. And never will this problem persist, because I did not fix these recently, which is why I'm confused. All right, I have to close that. God damn it. At some point, I'd love for the university to get wireless microphones that don't require AA batteries, that have some kind of dock that you plug them into when you're done. There we go. And it just recharges them rather than creating a bunch of toxic waste in the world. Okay. Alrighty. I'm sorry about this. I guess I could just let you all leave, but I'm not going to do that. It's 20 minutes early, and I'm running out of time. And now you get to see my very chaotic file system. Yay. Okay. There we go. See, I edited the PDF last year. Okay. Add items. Like I said, great TV, right? There, it is fixed. Now you can re-download them. I'm really sorry. I should have checked that Canvas had the right slides. All right, now you will have the correct slides, because that's the one I opened. And now I have to reopen it, and then we'll go back to what I was doing. Huzzah. All right. All right, so I fixed it. I am sorry about that. Okay, all fixed. I hope. Okay, do I like Canvas or eClass more? It doesn't really matter, because frankly, Canvas or eClass is going away in a couple of weeks. So, all right, now you have the same slides as me. Okay, Golden Dawn was the group Crowley was in before founding Thelma. I'm going to pretend that those are words that make sense to me. Ah, yes. Crowley. Thelma. Doesn't exist anymore, but its teachings are the founding of a lot of Western esotericism. Okay, cool. I don't know what Crowley or Thelma is. I feel old. All right. All right, here we are. Now you have the same slide as me. Let's talk definitions of religion. Okay, so we can kind of split definitions of religion into a bunch of different categories, and there's sort of two big categories, or I guess three big categories that we could talk about. We talk about, from classical sociology, substantive definitions, right, which are more our symbolic interactionist kind of ways of defining religion. Functional definitions of religion, which obviously are functionalists. And then we have a sort of conflict theory or kind of constructionist definition of religion, but we'll talk about that a bit. Okay, so the substantive definition of religion, right? It's about, not surprisingly, the substance of religion or what's in it. What is in religions? Okay, now all of these types of definitions have a bunch of problems, right? They all have certain issues, which has led to all of them being really problematic. But substantive definitions, emphasize, basically human beings' relationships with the supernatural in these kind of otherworldly elements, but especially it tends to focus on the elements of religion in these sorts of 7 categories. And again, really talks about what's inside religions, what religions are made up of, the stuff of religions. So things like rituals, right? And our rituals are, obviously deliberate traditional actions that forge a link between the religious person, the religious community, and whatever they consider to be holy, transcendent, divine, or whatever, right? So, this could be anything, right? It's the Mass in Catholicism, any of the religious rituals in Judaism, whether it's Shabbat or whether it's, things like bar mitzvahs, right? All of these things are rituals that are supposed to connect the individual to the community and to God, or things like the Hajj in Islam, or Islam's 5 pillars, right? The daily prayers and all of that stuff. Okay, so all of these are rituals, things that are done kind of repeatedly and deliberately that are meant to connect you, right? Those rituals are the stuff that makes up religion. Okay, the myths, right? And here, myths not meant in the sort of like, I'm on Reddit r/atheist and I want to insult religious people by calling religions just a bunch of myths. Here we mean myth in, I think, a much more kind of inclusive way, and a much less pejorative one. But basically, like, not as untrue or ancient stories or Bronze Age nonsense, or whatever people sometimes talk about, but the stories that religions have that are meant to kind of illuminate facts about the world, right? They're supposed to tell us, I guess we talk about this, a lot of the mythology is about the order of things. Why the world is the way it is, right? That's a lot. That's a lot of what mythologies are, right? They tell religious believers, why are we here? Why is there death and suffering in the world, right? Why don't we live in a perfect paradise, right? What are the origins of life and the universe and the meaning of things and our relationship to the world and the divine, right? This is what we mean by mythology. And again, it's not to say that it's untrue, just to say that these are stories that these communities tell themselves. They may be taken literally or allegorically or in any number of ways by those communities. Okay, so we got our rituals, our myths, our doctrines, right? Or the rules, right? The rules of particular religions, especially codified rules, but uncodified rules as well. So things that are written down or not written down, right? These are part of religion as well. Things like the Catechism of the Catholic Church in Catholicism, or the Code of Canon Law, things like Sharia in Islam, right? These are all, parts of religion. All right, ethics, right? The value standards of those, and the values and standards and behaviors expected of the faithful, right? Like, what are the rules that you're supposed to live with? The experiences that people are supposed to have, and then, of course, the social, right? The communities that people live in, right? This is part of the substance of religion in a substantive definition. And then the material spaces, right? Sacred spaces like churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and any objects or things that are considered sacred as well, right? Whether this be like, crosses or crucifixes on walls, or other religious symbols, prayer mats, whatever it happens to be, right? These are the material kind of dimensions of religion in a substantive definition. Also, right, the spaces, the cathedrals, the churches, the mosques, the temples, all that stuff. Okay. I've heard the name Alistair Crowley. I just can't remember it now off the top of my head. Okay, sorry, there's a question about 377 that got cleared somehow. There is no prerequisite for the course. At the moment, it may be restricted to third and fourth year students or maybe second, third, and fourth year students in sociology, who are majors and minors, because they get the first crack at it, but it'll open up in a few days once people have gotten their shot, because they want to make sure people get these courses before they close up. Okay, so how am I doing for time? I got 9 minutes. I'll keep going a little bit more. So functional definitions of religion, and again, we can think of our Durkheim here, right? This is what religion does, right? It's much more about not what religion is or what's inside religion, but what religion does. So this is a classic functional definition from Clifford Geertz, that religion is one, a system of symbols. Okay, so it's a system of symbols. And what do those symbols do? They act to establish powerful and pervasive and long-lasting moods and motivations in men. Oops. By formulating conceptions of the general order of existence and, right, so, all right, what does that mean? So religion is a series of symbols, right? So it's religious texts, symbols, physical spaces, all of that stuff. And what is that all meant to do? To set up long-lasting ways of thinking and acting in people by giving you a general sense of how the world is, right? Existence, why you're here, what you're supposed to do, and kind of clothing these conceptions with an aura of factuality, so that these moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Now, both are kind of substantive and functional definitions have a bunch of problems with them, in that, functional definitions, for example, one of the problems with them is that they're too broad. And this has been pointed out for a long time, right? They're too broad. And lots of people have suggested, for example, that this definition here, right, you could cross out religion, actually just leave religion in there, but if you put, like, say, American nationalism, it actually fits this definition reasonably well. So, right, American nationalism is a system of symbols, right? You got your Star-Spangled Flag, right? You've got your national anthem. You've got your Constitution of the United States. You've got your founding fathers, which are sort of like, the wise men or the gurus of this particular religion. So you've got a system of symbols. And what has that system of symbols done? Well, it's established powerful, persuasive, long-lasting moods and motivations, right? People have acted on behalf of the United States. They feel great passion towards the idea of America and the founding fathers and the Constitution, and all of that stuff. And it has definitely formulated a conception of the general order of existence, right? If you think of, like, Declaration of Independence, right? All men are created equal, and from that equal creation, they derive certain rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So that's a general order of existence right there. Don't ask me why I know. I can quote from memory the Declaration of Independence. And it closed these conceptions with an aura of factuality, so that those moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic, right? It seems, they create a sense that America is a real thing that exists. Really, America is a fictitious creation, right? There is nothing to say that America has to exist the way it does. It's just a social construction, as all nations are. But, that kind of factuality has generally created a sense that, America is real and that we should act on it, and people have in long sense. So functional definitions tend to be really broad and will include too much. Substantive definitions, right? Excuse me. At times, substantive definitions seem to be too narrow, right? In the sense that a lot of, like, our substantive definitions, right? It's not necessarily the case that every single religion has, any of these elements within them, right? There are religions of all kinds, for instance, that lack a lot of these qualities, right? They may not have a mythology, right? They may not have formal doctrines, like not all religions do. Certainly, like, let's say there's different forms of Buddhism, right, that actually don't have anything in particular formal doctrines. Buddhism is a very flexible, very different thing. Here, not every religion actually has a sense of the supernatural, right? There's certainly forms of Buddhism that don't have any conception of the, like, it's called Theravada Buddhism, that has no conception of a sense of the supernatural at all, right? It's much more, almost a materialist kind of religion, one that doesn't have any kind of sense of a transcendence. You know, they don't all have a beyond this world element, right? Some posit, you know, that everything is kind of part of this world and nothing exists outside of it. So not all religion, you know, it's too narrow. It excludes a lot of religions by its narrowness. Okay, got 4 minutes left. Okay, I talked about this. Oh, I had it here. Yeah, religiosity. You know, that's one of our key concepts, which we generally measure by measuring people's beliefs, behaviors, and belonging. Okay, why don't I hear the anxious zippers. Okay, I can do the slide in like 30 seconds, and then we'll start off on religion and society. Okay, so one of the things we know about religion, right, is that religiosity is a learned behavior, right? It is a learned behavior. If you raise someone without, you know, outside of a religious context, the chances that they will become religious are relatively low. So, we know that, say, in order to become religious or to have religiosity, you need things like opportunity, right? So there needs to be chances for you to um, be religious in some context, right? You have to be exposed to it. If you're not exposed to it, you're not going to naturally be inclined to religiosity, to the behaviors, beliefs, and the belonging that religiosity entails, right? There has to be a kind of need, right? And so one of the kind of things that people have long thought, and there's some dispute about this, but you know, we'll pretend it's true. Um, that generally people will get more religious as they grow older, right? As you you know, approach the undiscovered country from whose born no traveler returns. Um, it's a little Shakespeare for you for a Thursday afternoon. Um, you know, as you start to fear death, you probably need religion more. Whereas, you know, when you're healthy and in your 20s, you probably feel like you need religion less. Or if you've had like a life crisis, right? You've gotten addicted to drugs, a lot of people come to religion because of a particular need. So without that need, it's unlikely that you're going to develop religiosity. And of course, learning. There has to be someone to teach you about religion, right? Um, in order for you to become religious or to have those beliefs, behaviors, and belonging. It's not something that spontaneously generates, right? And all of our great religions, right? Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Baha'i, you know, any other Mormonism, any other religion that you can think of, right? There was someone there to teach you the specifics of that religion. Without it, it cannot. You're not going to, you know, just come to Christianity on your own, or Islam or whatever. Okay, there we go. 1 minute left. I feel better about that. We'll leave it here. We'll pick it up on Tuesday. Okay, and I will look these over so I remember what's in here.